using one of these historic photographs of her. So I went to Cambridge, Maryland, where Harriet Tubman was born. And I have to admit that I actually did not know that Harriet Tubman was born in Cambridge, Maryland until I was an adult. And the sad thing about that is that I grew up maybe an hour and a half from Cambridge, Maryland. And when I was in elementary school, my teachers never thought that it was an important connection for us to know that Harriet Tubman actually was born just down the road and had liberated about 70 or so black people. What a connection that would have been made, that would have been to have made. That the very same soil that I played on as a kid was very similar to that soil that Harriet led these 70 individuals across to freedom. So while I was in Cambridge, I actually collected soil from Harriet's family church. And I brought that soil back to my studio in DC, and I made a mixture of resin and soil, and I recreated this photograph of Harriet Tubman with tiny dots, probably no bigger than a popcorn kernel, that eventually came together to create this photograph. This is a work in progress. This is the largest sculpture I've ever made. And it is to commemorate a community not unlike this one. Just outside of Washington, D.C., there was a black community that was called East Arlington, and it was nicknamed Queen City. So there was a community of black folks that were living there pretty happily, pretty self-sustained. They had to be, because the surrounding community wasn't doing anything to take care of them, to make sure they had running water, that they had power, that they had fresh drinking water. Children were going to a nearby spring to get drinking water. And there was a well in their backyards, and they had outhouses as late as the 1940s. So during the World War II, my history is, I'm not as good as Alicia, but the War Department needed to build the Pentagon. They needed a big office building, right? Very focused on winning the war. And so they looked out at all this land. They looked in DC and they said, no, we can't build in DC, like it's too populated, like there's no place where we can really spread out. And so they looked across the river and they saw what they call a swamp. Nothing over there, it's just a swamp. So we'll build the Pentagon, we'll get rid of whatever's over there, and we'll build the highways and lay the sewage for the Pentagon. Actually, there was a community there, and that community was Queen City. And folks watched from their porches as this building was being built. And no one knocked on their door to tell them that they would have to leave until about 3 weeks. 3 weeks before they demolished the entire community. Yeah. So with this project, it's a nearby park that is about a mile away from the site. If I could put it closer to the actual community, I would, but there's actually a highway there right now, so I can't do that. But this is a 35-foot tall brick structure. When you walk into the structure, you can see the scale. When you look up, you're surrounded by 903 handmade ceramic vessels in the shape of a drop of water. So there were 903 individuals who were displaced 3 weeks before before construction of the Pentagon was started. And they were all brought back together here. All right, and here we are in West Palm Beach. This concept of genius loci, is at the heart of the artwork that I propose for Heart and Soul Park. Genius loci is Latin for spirit of a place. One of my favorite poets is named David White. Who's Irish, very white. But he has a brilliant use of language, and especially his language of talking about the land and landscape. And he says that in the ancient world, the word genius was not used so much to describe individual people. It was used to describe places, and almost always with the word loci or loci. And so genius loci meant the spirit of a place. We all have favorite places in the world, a seashore where you've got this ancient conversation between the ocean and the land and a particular geography of the way the cliffs and the beaches are formed. A weatherfront of all of these qualities that meet in that place. I think it is a very meaningful thing, merciful thing, to think of human beings in the same way. That is, your genius is the way everything is met in you. All of the struggles of your ancestors and arriving together and giving birth to you, the landscape in which you were nurtured, the dialect in which you were educated into the world, the smells of the local environment. It's the way everything meets inside us. This is a quote from a landscape architect named Sarah Zodi. And she says, and she's a black woman, and she says, as black people in America, we are walking around through this world knowing that places have these histories. Being gaslit by what we see in the physical world is exhausting. What would it feel like for the environment to reaffirm what you know about the history of this place? What is architecture or art like when you are having a dialogue with your ancestral landscape? And so, back on October 22nd, when I first visited this place, Gina took me over to look at I have a terrible sense of direction, but I think over there. She took me to see the shotgun houses that were reconstructed using the clapboard, the siding from the original shotgun houses. And I had a moment. I really had a moment in there. And I picked up one of those boards and I held it. I took pictures of it at every angle. I knew that I was holding something really special and that it was holding something special. So I remember first learning about shotgun houses when I went with my family to New Orleans. And the thing that people always say about the shotgun houses, I mean, I'm sure you guys have all heard, it's called a shotgun house because... Right, right. But with a little research, just a little digging, I discovered that shotgun houses are actually an African vernacular architecture. I had no idea. And so this is an image of a shotgun house. You see the porch, you see that the shape comes from the word togan, which means gathering place, and shogun, which means God's house. How beautiful, like why does no one say that? Why am I just learning that? It's incredible. And that knowledge of how to build that structure was embedded in the DNA of your ancestors, our ancestors. Those migrants who came to Palm Beach in hopes of building something, making a place, making a home for their families. And I think you all probably know this history. How black laborers, artisans, were brought to this area to build Palm Beach. But when Palm Beach was built up, the hotels were built up, the railroad was built, there was no longer a need. There was no longer a value tied to these people. And the goal was to wipe their communities, the sticks, from existence. And here's actually a newspaper clipping that uses that exact language. The good citizens of North Miami and at Palm Beach will petition the legislature to wipe from existence a community known as the Sticks. From accounts, it needs being done like this. All right, so we needed to have a reason to get rid of them. So using eminent domain, that same, you've heard that word time and time again. Eminent domain, that's how the folks who lived where the Pentagon was, that's how, same story. Reports of fires in the sticks. No one was putting them out. And I found, you probably know this person, right? So the interesting thing is that, there's this, it's this gaslighting thing. There's this story that gets put out there about what really happened, and then there's this folklore that we all talk about, that we know that's real, right? Along came this fellow named Henry Flagler, who decided that he needed that land to build on, to develop. He threw a party for the blacks on the island. They all came over to the party, and while they were celebrating and enjoying themselves, their homes on the island of Palm Beach burned down mysteriously. So I read that and I was like, what? And I emailed Alicia, I said, is this true? And I kept finding more. From what I heard, Flagler got with the residents and set up a party on the West Palm Beach side and had everyone ferried over to this big party, and then they had a mob of people to burn up the people's homes and shanties and tents over in the sticks and force them out of there. And they took the land over. Derek McCrae, thank you. There are so many historical facts that make some sort of scurrilous removal of the resonance believable, that it has become a lore, for the most part in the Black community. Here in Palm Beach County, we do such a horrible job of retaining the history of African Americans and our accomplishments and our contributions to this community. The Historical Society has a yeoman's task to convince us that the version that the African American community has of what happened is different. There is probably somewhere in between the Palm Beach County Historical Society's version of events and the African American lore of events, true, I added that. Somewhere in between. So you can take it how you find it. And that was Richard Wise. And so this is how I found it. What Palm Beach had in material wealth, West Palm Beach had in heart, soul, and genius. Cultural equator. Just wanted to point out again about how I really see my work existing in this space between the past and the present, joy, sorrow, loss, and celebration. They go hand in hand. Really, we don't have one without the other. Duke Ellington I have a special affinity for. Actually went to a high school named after Duke Ellington. I taught at that high school for about 10 years. I was researching for another project addressing Jacob Lawrence's Migration series of paintings. And I came across this great quote by Duke Ellington where he was talking about a song that he wrote that was called Harlem Air Shaft. Again, these kind of migratory communities, like we all share this common thing. He talks about the Harlem Air Shaft. So much goes on in a Harlem air shaft. You get the full essence of Harlem in an air shaft. You hear fights, you smell dinner, you hear people making love. You hear intimate gossip floating down. You can hear the radio. An air shaft is one great big loudspeaker. You hear people praying, fighting, snoring. I tried to put all that in Harlem air shaft. So he's describing this interior Black life. And it's in these interior spaces where we have true liberation, where we can completely be ourselves. We can be unsurveilled. And that's what I see when I look at these historic pictures of this place. Wow, this place.